everyone who is logged onto this session. To mention the delegates, the presenters that are in the house, the session chairs, the moderators, and some individuals that I can see in the room. Okay, so we are going to be starting our program for today. And today we've got quite a number of things lined up. We are going to start with our opening for the day, where we are going to have some keynote speakers, remarks. And then after that, we are going to be breaking for parallel sessions. And in the parallel sessions, that's where we are going to be having our presentation of papers. And the presentation of papers, we are going to be directed on the link that you are going to log into for you to join your parallel session. And then this will conclude in the afternoon at around 5, but we are going to be having a lunch break. And then the same again will happen tomorrow, which will be our last day for the conference. But without wasting much time, let me start by welcoming Prof. Guy Allen Zodi. Prof. Guy Allen Zodi is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. He is the HOD. So let me welcome Prof. Zodi, just to welcome the guests and the presenters, the delegates, and the session chairs that we are having in this room. Prof. Zodi, it's your time.
Thank you, Director of Ceremony. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to key speaker, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are located now. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the third International Multidisciplinary Information Technology and Engineering Conference, in short, IMITEC. I would like to warmly welcome the participants, composed of distinguished scholars, representatives from the business sector, colleagues, and students from across the world. Thank you for being part of this conference. The third International Multidisciplinary Information Technology Engineering Conference has kicked off yesterday and will serve as a new platform to imagine our future. The conference aims in exploring innovative ideas to transform our future, and due to the COVID-19 situation, the IMITEC 2021 is held as a completely virtual conference. IMITEC is an annual conference that brings together researchers and experts in the field of information technology and engineering to share their ideas, experiences, and insights. IMITEC 2021 is virtually co-hosted by the Faculty of Computing and Informatics and the Faculty of Engineering of the Namibia University of Science and Technology, and it is technically co-sponsored by the IEEE Computer Society and the IEEE Technical Committee in Data Engineering. The Faculty of Computing and Informatics has conducted many research activities of the past few years. This conference is also part of our continued efforts to bring together researchers as well as to create partnership between industry leaders, expert faculty members, and students across the world. So in today's session, we discuss brilliant and creative ideas in artificial intelligence, digital engineering and application, ICT development and society. I'm very happy to see the high number of quality papers that has been submitted, and proud to see the contribution of our colleagues and students of the Namibia University of Science and Technology to this event. Thank you to Mr. Gary Strobel, CEO of Future Media, for joining us to deliver the keynote address. I would like also to welcome the author of the 40 technical papers that will be discussed in this session. Thank you to you for your contribution to this event. I would like also to recognize the chairs of the different technical sessions, as well as all the people that will be sitting beyond the scene to help you accomplish your task. I'm thinking about the moderator of the sessions and the member of the technical teams. You are all welcome. I truly believe that the third IMITEC conference will help advance science and technology and help us to prosper. Let me close my speech by welcoming you all once more. I hope you will have a valuable experience during this event. You may share your best knowledge in your area of research and professional activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Zod, for the warm welcoming remarks. Let me take this opportunity to recognize the presence of Prof. Hannes de Waald, who is the Dean for the Faculty of Engineering. Thanks for joining. And I'll continue to recognize again Dr. Mulugi Mangwala from the Botswana International University of Science and Technology. Thank you for joining. We'll continue to recognize people who are joining our session. Okay, thank you for that. Now we want to move on with our program. We'll go to keynote speaker. So the keynote speech for today, we are going to get it from Mr. Gary Strobel. Just to give a brief background of who Mr. Gary is. Mr. Gary is a BA in Communication Science from the University of Free State, and he obtained as well a Master in Business Administration from the same institution. Mr. Gary has worked in media since getting involved as a student, and for 12 years, he has been the Chief Executive Officer of Central Media Group in South Africa. He later moved on to Namibia, where he is currently the Chief Executive Officer for Future Media Group in Namibia. And the Future Media Group is the holding company for the radio stations that we enjoy on a daily basis. These are Radio Wave, Fresh FM, Nova, Omulunga, to name the four that I know. I'm sure when you give Mr. Gary the opportunity, he will give us more information about himself and his relationship with NAST. So Mr. Gary, I give this opportunity to you to give us a keynote speech.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chikora, or Eagle Eddie, as he is called at the golf club, for his prodigious putting abilities. Thank you for inviting me into this conference as a member of the business sector. Often, in my experience, there isn't enough engagement between the academic pursuits and potentially business pursuits, and it's a wonderful opportunity to address you all. So thank you very much for that opportunity. Thank you to all the participants, as well as to, I told my staff I was going to be in late today, and one of them asked why, and I said it's because I'm going to be seeing about 25 doctors, and they were very concerned about my health. So thank you to all of you for giving me a good excuse as well. Let me share my screen. So as Dr. Chikora said, I represent an organization called Future Media here in Namibia, where we own and operate 4 individual national radio stations. Topic of my talk today, the ICTs and their impact on the media sector, often a very overlooked aspect, I think, of research and especially technology development, and a job today to talk a little bit about future research focus. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me this morning, and I hope your discussions and your deliberations were useful and successful yesterday. The ability to imagine a new future is a hard-fought and often overlooked skill, especially amongst those of you who have been gifted talents of creation and invention, and especially in the areas of technology and applied technology. I myself am a media practitioner. In my previous role, I was the CEO of a multimedia group in South Africa, covering radio, newspapers, outdoor advertising, as well as running a small company that focused on the emerging opportunities that the internet and related technologies allowed. There we built social media platforms, apps, and websites, and I saw firsthand how difficult ideas were to translate to technology and vice versa, especially for entrepreneurs who had one late night, their light bulb moment, and then we're trying to tell technology practitioners what that meant and how it should be executed. As you know, I currently own and operate 4 national radio stations here in Namibia. My job today, in the minutes allocated to me, is to plead with the minds listening to consider media, especially radio, and even more especially local radio, when thinking about your next research topic, or perhaps advising students on their next research topic. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the medium of radio, and then perhaps a few ideas of things that may prove interesting to you and that may be applicable in your various areas of research and study. Let's start with radio. The first real social media network. Radio is a two-way medium that allows listeners to engage in real time with the medium, and at the same time, it just allows them to enjoy a stream of uninterrupted content if that's what they choose. FM radio was invented in the 1930s as a way of giving higher fidelity sound than other existing technologies such as AM, shortwave, and longwave transmissions. It became very popular in the years that followed as music grew as a commercial industry and there's more and more music available. Tastes changed as well. It's really hard to enjoy a symphony on shortwave radio. It's now the worldwide standard as a commercial and civilian platform for a wide range of applications. The technology hasn't changed much in the last 50 years or so, except maybe for the addition of RDS, which is radio digital display, that little thing on your car screen that tells you what you're listening to. That came around in 1974, and that allowed text to be transmitted on a subcarrier to the main broadcast. And that's really been the last major technological development in the transmission of radio. Let's be clear, this lack of development is not due to a lack of adoption of the technology. Radio transmissions reach every square kilometer of the planet. And FM radio listening, as seen here, reaches upwards of 90% of most countries in the world. It's also not that the technology is perfect. There are still limitations and issues with FM broadcasting that require work, research, and development to overcome. You'll see the global average is 86%. And remember that much of the planet is dealt with countries that are across oceans. It's more that the advent of the internet, the brightest minds chase the shiniest stones with regards to physical technologies. But radio has evolved as a medium and should probably be better defined as audio technologies. With the advent of streaming technologies and the relatively low compression required for decent human voice reproduction, audio is growing enormously. As this graph demonstrates, this is simply research out of America about the growth of audio consumption on the internet. And we can see that is a very significant growth over the last 10 years or so. Consider that we now get satellite radio, digital radio, DAB+, which is the standard in Finland for transmission, as well as adopted in Australia. Streaming radio, podcasting, and audiobooks all form part of the universe of audio. Let's think about the African context for a second, where we know that the biggest barrier to economic growth is education, and two of the most critical development barriers are literacy and language. So if we consider some of these statistics, over 800 million radios already in developing countries. Compare that to the number of laptops that might be out there. 73% of farmers own a radio in sub-Saharan Africa, which makes it an ideal mechanism by which to reach a very important part of our food production chain. 3.9 billion people are still not connected to the internet, which means that radio has the universal connection that is often sought as a medium. The 21st century car radio, one tiny chip could replace the large circuit board in car radios and receive AM, FM, and digital radio. In Southern Africa, 9,000 children have access to education through solar radios after Tom Hanks organized a charity auction. And this will touch on some of the themes we'll talk about. A very quick Google search about radio in Africa highlights some big issues. Radio is Africa's most influential information outlet, according to many studies conducted by UNESCO. Community radios promote local development across Africa, that also from UNESCO. And then a government paper in the UK about radio and development in Africa that proves that radio is a cornerstone to further development in Africa. Radio reaches more people in Africa than any other medium, but remember that the technology is cheap, portable, it never runs out of data. It's not user dependent for capacity. In other words, 1 million people can be listening to a single transmitter without it ever affecting the uptake. It uses very little power, but most importantly, it speaks to people in their own language And perhaps even more importantly, it's already there. It's already rolled out and it's already enormously effective. So radio should be addressing the education crisis because it neatly hops over the literacy problem and the language problem. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is multi-layered, but the most important elements are who owns the stations that can actually solve the problem. And the overriding belief that pervades the internet technologies already fixed the issue. In other words, internet-only solutions attract funding and investment. And the guys that own the radio stations that can fix this problem are either small operators or state broadcasters. Because radio has traditionally been a source of power problems for African countries, the African governments typically don't like too many private radio owners because of the power of radio. They've generally been very nervous to license people with proper resources. And so many of the operators of licenses of communities or are limited in their transmission areas to stop too many dangerous ideas from spreading. And that limits them in their ability to scale their own businesses. This limits any single project, despite significant funding and content being available for information dissemination in Africa. The reality is that, and this is the heartbeat of what I'm saying to you today, is that the internet and FM go hand in hand. And both sets of technologies should be used in a combined way to drive real change, both in developed markets, but as well as in Africa and other less developed economies and population. And there is huge opportunity in this. Apps or other internet technologies do the work, while radio drives awareness, the education, and the trust to get people to actually utilize the technology by giving them real-time feedback systems. So radio is strong, but not the people who own radio. Wealthy radio owners are typically in major metros, playing music and creating entertainment. They're not keen to drive this kind of programming that will address these issues that we've mentioned, education and so forth, or necessarily other community issues. The owners or operators of more rural stations, which is typically where the biggest problems in economic development lie, have generally far less resources. And so often the focus for them is on survival of their business and not investment in innovation. So how can research, especially in the ICT area, help? Firstly, research itself. Radio listening, just gauging how many people are listening is a challenge. New technologies need to be developed that allow researchers to determine audiences. Better data on this drives both the commercial model, advertising follows data, but also gives educators, government, and foreign funders more confidence in using different platforms. Often the problem for foreign funders is understanding which platforms are successful in reaching people and therefore which ones should qualify for funding. We see this regularly in Namibia and are involved, for example, with both the UN and UNESCO and the American Embassy in giving them information as to where they can possibly invest money into community radio stations that will actually benefit the communities that they're trying to benefit. Also, there is plentiful research available on the impact of radio in Europe and American commercial markets. In other words, the ability of radio to drive behavioral change, but very little in an African context, especially outside of major cities. Often the barrier is a lack of technology, allowing researchers to actually get answers to this pretty simple question. More research is required on research methods, for example, using USSD technologies to drive data collection instead of IP technologies, perhaps using people meters or other ways to monitor listening and more accurately gauge audiences. What follows is a simple list of ideas that will require research. Each one of them requires extensive work, both in terms of the technology platforms as well as the use case. Ideally, a case study model that gives proof of concept. Funding often gets unlocked for major projects with proof of concept research. And this will lead to development. Firstly, people interested in putting the money into actually developing the platforms or implementing them and therefore getting implementation funding. So what I'll now run through is a number of ideas, and I'll go through it in fairly rapid form. I'm not going to expand on too many of them. And I'm happy to engage with anyone on this conference later about any of these ideas. They're not perfect. They haven't been thought through in every detail, but that's the point. We require research in order to drive the opportunity. And if you see opportunity in any of them, please, that's what I'm trying to do today. So we've discussed research, but let's talk about some other issues that affect communities. So an application that allows road users to report any adverse road conditions in real time on their cell phones. A simple button press and selection menu, for example, pothole, accident, obstruction, animals in the road, gives GPS data and possibly an optional photograph to report developing conditions. Radio then feeds that information back in real time to road users who are currently listening to the radio while they travel. And this is an ideal example of how the two technologies work in tandem. That data that is then collected over time becomes hugely valuable for infrastructural development, road repairs. We know that a pothole that's caught before it's 5 centimeters big costs almost nothing to repair, but once it's achieved 20 centimeters in space can cost upwards of 50,000 South African rand to repair. Let's talk about disease outbreak. Radio's role is to teach people to recognize certain symptoms. Often this is literature that's distributed, and in a low literacy environment, literature is very hard. But radio has the ability to both repeat messaging and to do it in a native tongue. And therefore, the information adoption is far higher. So radio teaches people to recognize certain symptoms, and a WhatsApp community or a community app or an automated SMS or a USSD platform allows people to report any new conditions or symptoms for quicker response and for community information. So as things are developing in real time, radio is able to feed that information back to communities in a responsible way that comes from a credible source, plus that information feeds through to both government and other organizations that are interested in following disease outbreaks. Weather conditions. A simple app allows people to report weather conditions at a much more granular level. Currently, we rely almost entirely on meteorological services, but things like clouds, rain, high wind, visibility, certain smells, and perhaps even certain other weather phenomena that allow for aggregated analysis, but also feedback in real time through radio. So a farmer in a field can observe something, press a button and report a certain phenomena using symbols and numbers as opposed to literacy methods that goes back into a database that starts doing much more granular weather analysis. Radio drives adoption by popularizing the platform, but also provides feedback in real time. Many radio stations have very broad weather information that they have available. They don't have granular weather available. And weather, as we know, a critical element in an evolving the climate crisis. Animal conservancy, which I believe that this is a huge issue, not only for ecotourism, but also for general conservancy all through Africa. Radio drives adoption of a platform, whether it be an app, a USSD, and again, the technology, there's lots of technologies that provide the same ability. But it more importantly rewards people for people who input animal sightings, animal behaviors, carcasses, incidents for aggregated analysis through a simple app with pictures and symbols. People know what an animal looks like, and therefore it's fairly easy to report with pictures. Feedback to communities in terms of things like animal sightings or dangerous animals happens in real time through radio. So as that information is fed into the network, radio feeds it straight back to the users, giving real reward to the people who input the data. But that also, again, that data becomes available to conservation societies, governments, national park systems, heritage societies, and so forth, which allows them to act in a much quicker and much more granular way than is currently the situation, where we still rely on people, but the feedback mechanisms are often quite poor. And again, radio is an intricate part of that program. Likewise for farming, especially medium and small scale farming, things like insects, weather, animals, fire, and general education items can be collated and fed back in real time through radio, highly elevating the value of data inputs. And again, lots of automated data inputs can be put into such a network, but making radio part of the information flow rewards the people who input the data, which is often where a lot of projects fail, is just simply getting people to do what they said they'd do, or widespread adoption of certain platforms. Let's look at economic development for a second. Likewise, for areas of further research for economic development include hard tech research, so into streaming compression algorithms, which allow lower data usage, possibly network independent technologies, and abilities for zero-rated traffic. Often, people have essential messages that they need to be able to transmit out there, and the simple barrier is cost of data. But people can make decisions to zero-rate data if the algorithms and the compression ratios and the various platforms that drive that allow for that to happen. This allows audio to utilize GSM, USSD, 2G, and 3G to reach far greater audiences. Everyone's waiting for 5G to happen, and in an African context, we're a long way away from 5G being realistically making a difference, especially in rural communities. But combined with FM technologies, these already existing platforms have fairly wide reach, and there is lots of hard tech opportunity in developing these technologies. Additionally, these technologies allow for greater use of alternative linking technologies. Radio itself has hard technology issues, and getting a signal from a studio to a transmitter Currently, satellite linking, RBR, which is radio relay by radio, or IP are all established platforms, but they all have severe limitations. And it's possibly in developing these low compression ratios that IP becomes a far more useful technology to relay signal from studio to transmitter or transmitter to transmitter, which increases the footprint of FM and lowers the cost for especially remote areas. And let's be honest, it's in the remote areas where the problems exist, but it's also in the remote areas where investment in hard technology like transmitters becomes a very expensive exercise. So if we can increase the footprints fairly cheaply by allowing transmitters to hop, that makes it far more worthwhile for FM operators to do that. Language learning is an obvious area where impact can be measured on a combined approach, app-driven content that is followed on the radio, classroom simulation. This applies to general education as well for many subjects where short bursts of teaching can have dramatic reach benefits. And we know that international language consumption sits on the internet, local language consumption doesn't. And as a result, we've either got to translate it all into a local language, or we've got to get local language users to be able to at least understand at a functional level some of these more global languages. And radio can form a huge role in that. In Africa, bringing products to markets is expensive. Under general education, I've noted here primary, especially in primary school, where some of the subjects are far easier transmitted through the medium of voice, being able to follow along using technology platforms, but follow along to a radio, which is a real person, and not video, which is reliant on a number of much bigger technologies, can still have a huge impact. So market prices. In Africa, bringing products to market is expensive, especially consider things like livestock, which are often sold at public auction. A huge opportunity exists to solve this problem of timing. There's a huge expense to timing when to bring your product to market by bringing market prices into the real time using radio and reporting technologies combined. Again, a combination of these things we've already discussed, but the huge impact here, especially for small and subsistence farmers, is to improve the actual yield to agriculture. So the money goes back into agriculture as opposed to where it goes to transport at the moment. And more often than not, the biggest barrier to effective farming is getting your product to the market. And there are ways in which radio and IP technologies can work together on this. Mostly, again, through adoption and education of the farmers. We know that farmers are high consumers of radio. The next two are pretty obvious, but a challenge in Africa is often municipal efficiency and developing local economies and ecosystems. And the problem with this is often a lot of the solutions that exist at the moment actually highlight how poor municipalities are, which is a very low incentive for municipalities to actually adopt these technologies because they don't want to be told they're failing. They rather find ways they're ultimately run by politicians mostly, and they want to tell people they're doing a great job. So how do we do this? Well, we allow for citizen-sourced information that goes into a system, things like reporting potholes, water outages, electricity outages, or perhaps even crime reporting, that goes into a central network. But the area where radio performs the role is to highlight successes. So something that does get fixed quickly can be spoken about, but only if it's known about. And often municipalities aren't very good at communicating, and neither are citizens. Once you've reported a pothole and got fixed, no one's going to come back and say, well done, because you don't see what isn't broken. So as a result, radio performs a hugely beneficial role in an ecosystem like this by rewarding the users, by giving them trust that what they report will actually get seen, and by highlighting successes of the municipalities and not necessarily focusing on the failures. And again, these are technologies that exist, but are just simply not built to accommodate an African context. Huge cost savings can be achieved through crowd-sourced data and early detection for municipalities as well. And this is often just goes to the sustainability of municipalities. Huge expenses are incurred through late detection of problems. But let's remind ourselves that the vast majority of radio operators and owners are journalists, not entrepreneurs. So proven platforms that address many of these areas first need to be researched so that funding, development, and execution are easier. Radio can solve many of the problems that technology and innovation bring. And often innovation is its own problem in that it brings change and people struggle with change, especially in areas of low education. Adoption is another huge problem with technology. Great ideas, no one's using it. You know, we don't have to go further than vaccination at the moment to understand how that drives many other areas of our life. But radio is incredibly useful at providing adoption models, training as well, allowing people the repetition to understand how to use new technologies, And then the virtuous cycle that true community involvement brings. In other words, when a whole community is actually involved in the solution, there is a huge virtuous cycle of cooperation that comes. But radio must be part of the model from the beginning. So the challenge is to provide radio operators deployable technologies that only require adoption, that solves real community problems. And another Facebook extension doesn't solve community problems, but ideally with the potential for funding or commercial appeal, because both technologies and platforms that are able to be funded by external donors or funders or even governments, or are funded through advertising or other commercial models, are easily adoptable by radio, especially small operators for whom any kind of additional revenue can often be the difference between success and failure. So I've given you guys a mouthful and I've used up all my occupied time. I'd be more than happy. So what next with this sort of information? Well, anyone that does have an idea, be more than happy to guide you. My contact details are on screen and can be achieved through the program organizers. I would encourage you to engage with community radio stations in your areas or commercial radio operators. They're not out there talking to academics. It's just not something that intersects with our world. But if you have a good idea and you go and talk to your local radio guys, they're generally pretty flexible and quite open to change, especially where it touches the lives of their listeners. Another point of first intersection that would be very useful for researchers is to speak to regulators. Regulators in African countries sit with enormous problems in trying to figure out what to do with this particular layer of technology. That's their problem. They've got their hands full with telcos and IP guys, and so they never focus on broadcasting. And as a result, they often have enormous research problems in that space, and would be more than happy to engage with academic researchers looking to solve problems in that space. So regulators in your countries would also be great places to start a conversation on what are actual problems. That brings me to the end of my talk today. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and the best of luck over the next couple of days as you share great ideas and look at some of the papers. There really are some very interesting problems that you guys are hoping to solve. Please consider radio as a partner in the evolution of the human condition. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Gary, for the insightful presentation that was well articulated. Actually, I can say the first time I met Gary, I found him to be someone who's so passionate about technology. And I really want to take it as a challenge to say, all technologists, all researchers, please, you can talk to Gary and see his ideas on where he wants to take the radio and how he thinks radio can partner the community. That would be an opportunity. Certainly cannot underestimate the power of partnership. This is the way to go into this world. We have to partner, share our knowledge in everything that we do. It was quite important to note that from your speech, Gary, you talked about radio resolving or trying to help to alleviate the challenges that we are having in Namibia, especially the human-wildlife conflict. We've got quite a lot of challenges where human and wildlife, they are conflicting, and the radio is coming into play to try and help. So what I would challenge each and everyone to do is to say the gap between the problems that we have in our communities and the solutions that we are supposed to be having for those problems is research and development. And this is the opportunity to partner. This is the opportunity to harness ideas that will give us solutions. Thank you, Gary, once again. We'll keep in touch. We'll also keep you in the loop in everything that we'll be doing at NAST. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Right. Let me continue to recognize the presence of our acting dean, Prof. Fungai Bunushawa. We've got again Prof. Singh, who is the professor in computer science. Thank you for joining. We have got Dr. Munyela, who is our associate dean, research and development, research and innovation, sorry. Thank you for joining. And then moving on with our program, I realized that I've recognized many people and I've introduced again other people, but I forgot to introduce myself. I'm your director of ceremony, and my name is Ed Mochkora. I'll be with you this morning until we break to our sessions. Right, moving on the program, we have remarks from Mr. Leo Marwasa. Mr. Leo Marwasa is not a new face at NAST, but most people might not know him. Maybe just to give a brief introduction of who Mr. Leo Marwasa is. Mr. Leo is the head of data and analytics at Telecom Namibia, and he consults local and international organizations. He has over 20 years experience in information technology and started out as a consultant at NAST. He has consulted for many organizations, to mention the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is the FAO, the UNACTAD, this one I could not understand the acronym, maybe you let us know. He has also consulted, he has also done some agri-consulting in Europe, that is the EASA. He has also done some consultation with the Bank of Namibia. He has also done with the European Union, just to mention a few. So Mr. Leo's bio is quite big, quite long, if I can put it that way. But however, let's get to know what he has for us in this conference today. And if anyone maybe wants to engage more with Mr. Leo, you can get him from our contact detail. We also upload some of the information onto our website so that you can have continuous engagement with the speakers that we're having. Mr. Leo, it's time for you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear.
Yeah, it's clear, Mr. Leo.
Okay. All right. So without taking too much time, you know, when you give former lecturers the platform, they tend to talk too much. So I think, let me start my timer to self-regulate here. So I am gonna be speaking more on the issue of IT governance. I think in the past day, we've seen quite a lot of awesome presentations. We've joined into some of the workshops. We learned quite a few things. We've seen new amazing technologies that are really coming online and are now being mainstreamed, even here in Namibia. And it's good to see that with the likes of the presentation that we saw of what's happening, for example, on the diamond mining ships, where they are now building visualized modules that basically help them identify, you know, with 99%, I think, success rate in terms of now the diamond samples, et cetera, et cetera. We're actually seeing this technology that looks like science fiction already being mainstream into everyday business operations. But one of the things that I recall having in academics a while back was that the time that we were learning, there was very little discussion with regards to the issues of IT governance or information technology governance. Now, speaking of how do we actually make sure that we actually get value out of our IT investments at the end of the day. So what I'm gonna do, let me quickly maybe share my screen. Sorry, I have multiple screens. This is a problem with people that work with data. They always have too many screens open simultaneously because they are looking at multiple things at the same time. Apologies for that. Let me quickly go backwards here. Okay. So when we talk about enterprise governance of information technology, when I talk of IT, most of the time back in the days when we spoke of IT, we were talking about the IT department, as in the support department that basically supported the end users with their PCs and their laptops and maybe the occasional enterprise resource planning system. But then what we have seen now, especially with what has happened with COVID, something that I don't think most of us ever thought would ever happen in our lifetime, is that a lot of organizations have now been forced to digitally transform. their operations and activities and how they engage with customers. To a certain extent, even the most rigid of organizations such as GRN has been forced to adopt certain ways of working, which they would never have thought of adopting before. I mean, how many people would ever have thought that they'll be allowed to work from home, even at Polytech? I mean, NAST, sorry. Pardon me, I'm too used to the old way. So just correct me if I mentioned Poly, that it's now NAST, it's now a university. Okay, so basically, we've been forced to change how we work, and we've been forced to adopt new ways of working. And as part of that, we have also been forced to make use of technologies and platforms that some people might not really have been familiar with. And the CEO's, my CEO's talk yesterday, Stanley, was basically on the issue of, for example, security, which has come to the fore as a result of more people moving online and working online and engaging via this digital platform that they never really used to do before. And as a result, you will notice that the number of security or cybersecurity events has actually increased. I know a lot of organizations, especially here in Namibia, also keeping some of those things secretive. You know, they actually had cyber security issues, but we have seen an increase in the number of cybersecurity events of the negative nature in business across different industries and so forth. But the thing is that there's a little talked about area of business, so to say, that we refer to as information and technology governance, that if we actually were to make sure that our organizations actually practiced and adopted certain levels of IT governance, then risks associated with information technology and adoption of new technologies would be highly reduced. Now, in terms of the previous presenters, especially like from yesterday, for example, adopting simply as simple as adopting, for example, R as a analytics language for you to analyze your data, et cetera, in a typical organization. Now, most people say this technology is out there, it's available. Everybody by now should know about it, for example, and its advantages and how it can help my business. And yet you find that there are a lot of organizations that are still not really that agile or moving towards adopting these new technologies. And most of the time people will ask themselves, why is that? I mean, what exactly is happening that some organizations seem to be a little bit more adept at adopting and, you know, assimilating these technologies? Because at the end of the day, we need to be able to assimilate some of these things that are coming from these conferences. It's not good enough for us to come and sit here and always listen and then hear about all the wonderful things technology can do and what everybody else is doing with it. But on our own, we are not really, as organizations, really adopting it and assimilating it into our technology spaces, basically. So the key thing that I have really realized that really comes down to how we actually understand the role of an organization or a company or an entity. And most of the time you realize that really the key purpose organizations exist is to create value for their stakeholders in one format or another. And then if they exist to create value for their stakeholders, or that is the primary end goal, it also stands to reason that whatever we do must ensure the creation of that particular specific value. So if your organization's aim is to educate people or to train people to be capable of doing or being functional in society, for example, you would want to make sure that all the underlying activities that are undertaken in the organization are driving towards that common value creation point, and that they are not pulling in different directions. Because once they start pulling in different directions, usually you end up missing the mark completely. So in layman's term, what IT governance is really trying to do for an organization is to ensure that there is some value being realized out of any IT investments or adoption of any IT technologies or platforms or solutions within that particular organization. Now, the beauty of the world of IT is that a lot of it is based on science and standards and frameworks that are already there. And what we tend to find is that there are already a lot of frameworks that have already been created for you to be able to set up your IT governance frameworks that are easy to adopt in most instances, that can help you align your IT towards your actual enterprise goals at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, we want to have IT that's aligned with business, that is actually helping to deliver on the overall value of what exactly the business is trying to do. So going from there, I'm not sure how many people have ever come across COBIT before. I'm sure you've come across other standards like your ITILs and TOGAF, et cetera, that have been around for quite a while, and they're quite matured. Some of you might have come across, for example, what was previously referred to as COBIT 5. It's now COBIT 2019. But basically, the aim of that particular framework is to give you something that, as a company, you can be able to quickly set up an IT governance program that just increases your chances of success in terms of your IT projects, adoption of new IT technologies, and also ensuring that you're fully aligned with the rest of the business, because there's tremendous value to be had from making sure you're fully aligned with the rest of the organization. And the current rendition of COBIT 5 is now been upgraded. It's now called COBIT 2019. It adopts practically all major frameworks. So it's an overarching framework that is there. It adopts practically all major frameworks that you can think of, from the cybersecurity frameworks to your ISO standards, all the way to your ITILs and your TOGAFs, et cetera. So it's really comprehensive in nature to ensure that at the end of the day, I am able to set up an IT governance program that really returns value for my intended stakeholder, which is now obviously the business owners at the end of the day. So as I mentioned, this particular framework is an overarching kind of IT governance framework. It has really matured over the years. It's tried and tested. Practically almost all the big four audit firms right now use COBIT in one form or the other to conduct their their audit activities of IT especially, and IT operations. And there are quite a lot of, advantages to adopting these frameworks that have already been set up and exist and have been tried and tested in terms of now your organization or industry, et cetera. Now, going on from there, in light of our recent experience with COBIT, we've seen things like the issue of digital transformation being pushed practically down people's throats, because we have been forced to adopt that way of working. And because now we don't have a choice but to adapt, obviously we also need to make sure that we have the right management frameworks in place, the right governance frameworks in place to make sure that we are moving in the right direction. Otherwise, it can also become an inhibitor to your adoption of different or new technologies that could actually enable new business paradigms, that could enable new ways of doing business, that could enable your business to move into areas that you did not previously maybe think about. Okay, so at the core of it, again, is still stakeholder value creation. And at the core of it is to realize that as far as IT is normally adopted or loved by us technology practitioners, we need to also consider the business side of the technologies that we are looking at and how these technologies will get assimilated into the business itself or mainstreamed into the actual business itself. Now, unfortunately, because of time, obviously, I would not be able to go into too much details of all the underlying elements, for example, of COBIT, et cetera, and how it can be applied to a particular practical business case, how you can go about designing a governance system for a particular enterprise or business, depending on the enterprise's unique requirements and needs. But the key thing is that this is a highly adaptive model, and it can be tailored to a specific organization's needs and requirements, looking at their risk appetite, looking at their IT, the nature of their IT organization. Is it a support function, or do you view IT as an enabler, something that enables you to create new value propositions, looking at the organizational culture and so forth and so on. All the people issues, all the process issues around the organization. But what we need to understand is that in as far as adopting these technologies that have been presented within this workshop, we really need to make sure that our organizations really have some form of IT governance in place that enable us to realize benefits or to ensure benefits realization from any investments in these particular technologies, and also allows us to do some risk optimization or limit the risk to adopting those technologies. Because I'm sure even when they adopted the technology on the De Beers ship, they had to make sure that they optimize what are the risks, or looked at what are the risks of adopting that technology and mainstreaming it into their operations and so forth. So just as the same, if you want to now introduce data science as a practice within your organization, you need to make sure that at the end of the day, it's not just for the sake of being out there to say, I have the latest technology, but to make sure that it is actually fulfilling a purpose in the enterprise overall objective. Okay, I think I'm already out of time, yeah? I'm gonna stop right there. Otherwise, I tend to talk for too long, but I think I hand it back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Leo, for the insight. I really appreciate your presentation, especially when you talk about COBIT, governance of IT. Those are really burning issues that we're having. As we're doing your presentation, it just came into my mind to say, okay, fine, as we have our theme to say, imagining the future. So how will be the future like? That's where the challenge is. So I was trying to think, maybe you can also, as we are going to have our question and answer segment soon after this, you might also think around the scenario whereby I was thinking to say, everyone is talking about technology. We want to advance to fourth industrial revolution, where we say technology, robots will be more like taking over the processes that people are doing. And it came into my mind to say, okay, fine. So if a robot commits a crime, who must be arrested? Is it the robot, the owner of the robot, or the manufacturer of the robot? So I'm trying to imagine the future that we are creating. So your issue of governance of IT really come hand as we move on to our fourth industrial revolution. Thanks, Mr. Marwasa, for quite an insightful presentation. Now we are moving on to question and answer segment with two speakers, that is Mr. Gary, who talked about the media. We have got Mr. Leo, who touched quite a number of things regarding IT governance. So let me give this opportunity to the floor to ask questions. Mr. Gary is back and Mr. Leo is in. So let me see by raising of hands the questions that you might be having. So for those who cannot do voice, you can still use the chat room we still access your questions and forward them. Wow, so those two presentations were quite good. There's no one who needs to understand further than what you've just, oh, I've got a question. Teresa, you can come in.
Good morning. My question is to Mr. Gary. When he was presenting on the radio technologies, I just want to know, how has the advent of the internet and these social media platforms affected the traditional platforms like radio? How do you guys still keep your presence? Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Firstly, radio already has a 90+ reach in most countries in terms of adoption and uptake, whereas Facebook in many countries has somewhere between a 30 and a 45% uptake. So obviously that is often fueled by urban populations, but it is a normal human trait to believe me and the people around me are the rest of the world. So radio keeps its presence through a number of things. Firstly, radio is accessible while you're doing other things like driving or commuting, whereas many of these technologies are not. Radio is free to access for people. Once they have a receiver, they only have to pay for a receiver once and they can access it for the rest of their lives for free. So there's a huge uptake to that. Secondly, social media requires a high degree of literacy often, which is often lacking in many large populations. But people also like to be entertained without having to do too much. And so radio provides a constant stream of entertainment and information with you having to do nothing. We all know how frustrating that little Facebook scroll can become when you're actually trying to find something interesting to look at. Radio programming, by the most part, is able to get that right. So radio is an entirely different medium. Obviously, there has been a shift for, especially in younger audiences, away to more curated playlists, so streaming services. But what we're finding over the last 2 years is that there's actually a shift back. Even though as adoption grows for those platforms, many users are coming back to radio, more traditional radio, because of people. They like hearing people with their own accents and dialects speak. We're using their own words. Americanization of the world happens largely through social media platforms. And so as a result, local radio is often able to host or to keep very loyal audiences by being very locally relevant and speaking about things that are immediately around them. So there's a number of different ways in which the medium has unique advantages over potentially social media.
Thank you, Gary, for the response. Not sure if there's a follow-up question, Teresa, or you are satisfied?
I am answered. I think he has elaborated fairly well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, while I'm waiting for any other question that might come, I again continue to recognize all the participants from international scene. We have got Ms. Gundidza from Midland State University, Zimbabwe, Mr. Madzima, Soplach, South Africa, Mr. Chikati from Botswana, you're welcome. We have Freda Kanyemba, IUM, of course, is local. And also let me take this opportunity to recognize Dr. Colin Stanley, who is with us in the room. Dr. Colin Stanley is the acting DVC for Research, Innovation, and Partnerships at NAST. You're welcome, sir. It looks like, okay, we've got a question on the chat. I hope I'll be able to articulate it properly. Now the question says, for an IT professional, which certification between the above two? The above two are COBIT and ITL, would be ideal for an IT professional in an organization. I think this is directed to Mr. Leo. And then let me give you another one again so that you can just respond at once. Hi, Mr. Leo. Can you talk a little about the relationship between COVID and regulations like GDPR? I guess you understand what GDPR is. Mr. Leo can take it up.
Okay, let me unmute myself quickly. So normally it depends, I guess, between ITIL and COVID. At the end of the day, it depends on where you actually want to play. The other one is looking at more the service, IT service delivery, which is ITIL. Let me make sure I get the correct definition there. So it's looking at the best practice workflows and so forth for service desk, IT service desk management, which is a small area under IT governance. So IT governance is far, far broader. It's more strategic also in nature. So it's looking at the overall organization, value creation from all IT investments, et cetera, et cetera. So normally what I say is that where exactly do you want to play? Where do you want to be? Do you want to be at the more strategic level, or do you want to be at the more operational service desk management type of level? So if I am wanting to be more at a strategic level, then I'll normally go for the COVID type of certification, which normally deal with overall management, designing the overall governance system, managing the governance program, and so forth and so on. Okay, with regards to general data protection, which is now your GDPR, again, the relationship between those COVID and GDPR is dealing, like as the name implies, it's dealing with the data protection elements. Now within COVID, you've got what we call the various practices and so forth. Unfortunately, like I said, it will take a bit long to go through how it all distills down from the strategy to those practices and domains to actual activities, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, data protection would fall into one of the areas or practices that we would have falling under COVID, for example. So the relationship there is that this is normally a standard that you would adopt, for example, in COVID, to make sure that you actually meet those regulatory and compliance requirements around general data privacy regulations, so that we make sure that we protect the rights of the privacy around that data, and also make sure that we keep it safe at the end of the day. So the key thing there is that the one is strategic in nature, the other one will be focusing again on a specific area, and COVID would tend to adopt or work with a lot of these standards and guidelines and framework and regulations like GDPR, et cetera, POPI, and so forth. I don't know if I've answered your question there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Leo, for the response. Let me check if you have got follow-up questions on your response. Looks like the two are satisfied. Okay, let me take this opportunity to thank the presenters. Mr. Leo.
I have a hand.
Oh, there's a question.
Sorry. Yes.
Oh, there's a follow-up. You can come in.
Okay. My follow-up question is directed to Mr. Leo.
Yes.
So I'm sitting here thinking that, so based on your explanation, so GDPR would feed in, or would be maybe would be part of the things that would be covered by COVID, right? By COVID, sorry, not COVID.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, that would you say by default, if we do our COVID implementation, if we follow COVID by the book, by default, would you say would also be fine with GDPR, would be fine with POPI, and so on?
Oh, okay. All right, not 100% per se, because remember, like I'm saying, COBIT is now looking at more the governance side of things, the processes, the procedures that you need to have in order to have effective alignment between IT and the organizational goals and strategies to ensure that we get value on our IT assets. So although COBIT would take due cognizance of now all these frameworks and standards and guidelines, you still have got certain implementation modalities that exist under GDPR, where you will be required to actually ensure that you comply if you're, for example, a financial services provider with some of those requirements. So you would still be required to understand what are the requirements under GDPR, what are your obligations under GDPR, et cetera, and to make sure that you actually comply and adhere to them. Whereas COBIT would just tell you to be aware that, listen, you need to do a scan of your environment and look at what are the rules and regulations governing your environment and make sure that you are actually meeting and complying with those particular requirements. So it just helps you to make sure that you don't miss critical elements that you need to comply with or adhere to.
Thank you for the response, Leo. Any follow-up question?
Thank you, Mr. Leo.
Great. Okay, let me take this opportunity to thank our presenters, Mr. Leo, Mr. Gary. We really appreciate your time to be with us. We'll continue to engage in our future events, and we continue again. The participants, if they've got any questions, certainly we direct them to you. Thank you once again. Now we've come to a time where we are supposed to break our parallel sessions, where we are going to be having some presentations of the papers that were submitted to the conference. So we've got two parallel sessions, that is Group A and Group B. Yeah, we've got Group A and Group B. Group A, the theme is artificial intelligence, and then Group B, we've got digital engineering and applications.